Before we start, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Maybe you're going through a divorce right now and feeling like your world is falling apart. Maybe you've been through one and you're still carrying the pain years later. Maybe you're in a marriage that's struggling and you're terrified of what might happen next. Maybe you think successful people don't feel the same heartbreak that you do. This conversation is for you. I want to tell you about the darkest period of my life. Not when Tesla almost went bankrupt, not when SpaceX rockets were exploding, but when my marriage to Tallulah Riley ended the second time, and I thought I might never recover. Most people know I've been married 3 times. What they don't know is how close I came to giving up on everything, not just love, but life itself, during one of those divorces. How a legal proceeding turned into an existential crisis that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself, about relationships, and about whether any of it was worth the pain. People assume that when you're wealthy, when you have the resources to hire the best lawyers and therapists, when you can afford to take time off and recover in luxury, that divorce is just an inconvenience. A business transaction with emotional complications. They're wrong. Money doesn't cushion the blow when someone you love tells you that loving you has become too painful to continue. Success doesn't protect you from the specific kind of failure that happens when another human being concludes that their life is better without you in it. In some ways, having resources makes it worse, because you can't blame the end of the relationship on external circumstances. You can't tell yourself it would have worked if only you'd had more money, or more time, or more opportunities. You have to face the possibility that the problem is simply who you are as a person. This isn't a story about blame or fault. It's a story about how losing love can feel like losing yourself, and how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to discovering who you really are. The divorce I'm talking about wasn't my first, but it was the one that nearly destroyed me, not because it was the most acrimonious or expensive, but because it happened at a moment when I had nothing left to cushion the fall. It was 2016. Tesla was hemorrhaging money and facing production delays that threatened the company's survival. SpaceX had just suffered a catastrophic rocket explosion that set us back months and cost us millions. The media was calling me a fraud, investors were losing confidence, and employees were questioning whether they should stay with companies that seemed destined to fail. In the middle of all this professional chaos, my personal life collapsed. Tallulah and I had already divorced once before, in 2012. We remarried in 2013 because we thought we had learned from our mistakes that we could make it work the second time. We were wrong. The problems that broke us up the first time were still there, just buried under hope and good intentions. I was still obsessed with work to the point where I couldn't be fully present in the relationship. She still needed more emotional connection than I knew how to provide. We still had fundamentally different ideas about what marriage should look like. I had convinced myself that because I loved her, because I wanted the marriage to work, because I was willing to try harder, that would be enough. But love without the skills to sustain love is just good intentions that create bad outcomes. Wanting something to work and knowing how to make it work are completely different things. The second time around, we had all the same conflicts, but they felt heavier because we both knew what they meant. When I stayed late at the office to solve a technical problem instead of coming home for dinner, it wasn't just about that one evening. It was about a pattern we had seen before. When she expressed frustration about feeling disconnected from me, it wasn't just about that moment. It was about whether this was simply who I was and who she was, and whether those two people could ever really build a life together. But this time, the divorce felt different. The first time, we had separated amicably, with mutual respect and understanding that we just weren't compatible as spouses. The second time felt like a referendum on whether I was capable of loving anyone in a way that wouldn't eventually drive them away. When someone leaves you once, you can tell yourself it was circumstantial, that the timing was wrong, that you were both too young or too different. When they leave you twice, when they try again and still conclude that life is better without you, it's harder to avoid the conclusion that the problem is you. I remember the night she told me she wanted to end the marriage. We were sitting in our kitchen, and she was crying, and I felt completely helpless. Not the kind of helpless you feel when facing a technical problem that has a solution you haven't found yet. the kind of helpless you feel when you realize that trying harder might actually be making things worse. She said something that haunts me still. Elon, I don't think you're capable of being married to anyone. You love your work more than you could ever love a person, and that's not wrong, but it means you shouldn't promise people something you can't give them. Those words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were said in anger or meant to hurt, but because they were said with sadness and what felt like genuine concern for my well-being. She wasn't attacking me. She was trying to help me understand something about myself that she could see, but I couldn't. I had always prided myself on being someone who could learn from mistakes, who could adapt and improve and solve problems through effort and intelligence. But she was telling me that this wasn't a problem I could solve by trying harder. She was telling me that the very qualities that made me successful in business, the obsessiveness, the inability to accept anything less than optimal outcomes, the tendency to lose myself completely in whatever I was working on, those same qualities made me fundamentally unsuited for marriage. The worst part was that I couldn't argue with her. I couldn't say she was wrong, couldn't promise to change, couldn't point to evidence that I had learned how to balance my obsessions with my relationships. I had tried, genuinely tried, but my definition of trying and her definition of what was needed were fundamentally mismatched. That conversation broke something in me that had never been broken before. I had survived business failures, public humiliation, financial ruin, family tragedies, but I had never had someone I loved look me in the eye and tell me that loving me was too painful to continue. The divorce proceedings themselves were relatively straightforward. We didn't fight over money or property. We didn't have children together to complicate custody arrangements. We just had to untangle two lives that had been woven together twice and figure out how to be kind to each other while acknowledging that kindness hadn't been enough to make the marriage work. But emotionally, I was drowning. I had always been someone who processed difficult emotions through action. When my first company was struggling, I worked 20-hour days to turn things around. When PayPal faced technical challenges, I threw myself into coding solutions. When SpaceX rockets exploded, I immediately started analyzing what went wrong and how to fix it. Action was my therapy. Problem solving was my coping mechanism. But there was no action I could take to fix this. There was no amount of effort that could make someone love me differently than they did. There was no technical solution to the problem of being fundamentally incompatible with something I desperately wanted. For the first time in my adult life, I couldn't work my way out of pain. Usually, when life got difficult, I could throw myself into solving problems, building things, making progress on goals that mattered to me. Work had always been my refuge, my identity, my source of meaning and self-worth. But now work felt pointless. Tesla's struggles felt like evidence that I was failing at everything, not just marriage. SpaceX's setbacks felt like confirmation that I was delusional about my own capabilities. Every day brought new reminders that I was disappointing people who had believed in me, trusted me, invested in me. I stopped sleeping properly. I lost weight. I found myself staring at walls for hours, not thinking about anything productive, just replaying conversations and wondering where everything had gone wrong. The media attention made everything worse. Every article about the divorce included speculation about how it might affect my companies, whether I was distracted, whether investors should be concerned about my emotional state. My personal pain became public entertainment, and my professional reputation became collateral damage in a story that felt too private and too complicated for headlines. I remember one particularly dark night, maybe 3 months after Tala and I separated, when I was alone in my house, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had felt genuinely happy, not satisfied with an accomplishment, not excited about a breakthrough, not proud of progress, just happy to be alive. I was sitting in my kitchen at 2 a.m., staring at my phone, wanting to call someone, but realizing I didn't know who to call. Not because I didn't have friends or family who cared about me, but because I didn't know how to explain what I was going through. How do you tell someone that you feel like a failure at the most basic human task of loving and being loved? How do you admit that all your professional success feels meaningless when you can't figure out how to be the kind of person someone wants to wake up next to every morning. I found myself going through old photos on my phone, looking at pictures from happier times in the marriage, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things started going wrong. But that was the problem. There was no single moment. It was a slow erosion, a gradual realization that we were trying to force something that didn't fit, that love alone wasn't enough to bridge fundamental differences in what we needed from a partnership. That scared me more than any business crisis ever had. I had built my entire identity around being someone who could solve problems, overcome obstacles, turn setbacks into comebacks. But I couldn't figure out how to solve the problem of being fundamentally unable to sustain intimate relationships with people I cared about. I started wondering whether success in business was actually making me worse at everything else. Whether the qualities that made me effective as an entrepreneur, obsessiveness, impatience, inability to accept anything less than optimal outcomes, were the same qualities that made me impossible to live with. For the first time, I seriously considered whether I should step back from everything, take time to figure out how to be a better person before trying to be a better leader. I thought about selling my stakes in my companies, moving somewhere quiet, starting over with a completely different approach to life. The turning point came from an unexpected source, thinking about my children from my first marriage. I was looking at photos of them one evening, and I realized that regardless of how much I had failed as a husband, I couldn't afford to fail as a father. My children needed me to figure out how to be whole, how to find meaning and purpose, even when romantic love seemed impossible, how to build a life that was sustainable and fulfilling even if I never managed to sustain a marriage. I realized that my children would be watching how I handled this crisis, and that would teach them more about resilience and self-worth than any lecture I could give them. If I collapsed completely, if I couldn't find a way to rebuild my sense of purpose and meaning, what would that teach them about how to handle their own inevitable failures and disappointments? I also realized that I had been modeling an unhealthy relationship with work for them. They had watched me disappear into my companies for days at a time, had seen me choose meetings over meals, had learned that work was the most important thing in Daddy's life. Even if I couldn't fix my capacity for romantic relationships, I could model a healthier relationship with achievement and success. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I was going to stop trying to fix my capacity for romantic relationships and start focusing on becoming the kind of person my children could be proud of, regardless of my marital status. I started therapy for the first time in my life. Not couples therapy, which I'd tried before, but individual therapy focused on understanding my own patterns, my own needs, my own contributions to the dynamics that kept destroying my marriages. I learned things about myself that were uncomfortable but necessary. I learned that I'd been using work as a way to avoid emotional intimacy, not just with my wives, but with myself. I learned that my need to control outcomes extended to relationships in ways that were suffocating for my partners. I learned that I had been expecting marriage to solve problems in my life that only I could solve. The therapy sessions were brutal. Week after week of confronting patterns I had been unconscious of, admitting to motivations I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, recognizing ways I had contributed to the failure of relationships I thought I had been trying desperately to save. I learned that I had been attracted to the idea of marriage more than the reality of it. I loved the concept of having a partner who understood and supported my mission, but I hadn't been willing to do the daily work of understanding and supporting theirs. I loved the idea of coming home to someone who would help me decompress from work stress, but I hadn't been willing to leave work stress at work so I could be present for their emotional needs. Most uncomfortable of all, I learned that I had been unconsciously seeking partners who would fix the parts of my life I didn't want to deal with. The loneliness, the social isolation, the emptiness that came from having no interest outside of work. I had been looking for someone to solve the problem of my own incompleteness, instead of becoming complete myself first. Most importantly, I learned that my worth as a human being wasn't dependent on my ability to sustain romantic relationships. I could be a good father, a good friend, a good leader, a good person, even if I was terrible at being a husband. This realization was simultaneously heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it meant accepting that something I wanted very much, a lasting, loving marriage, might not be possible for me. Liberating, because it meant I could stop measuring my life against that standard and start building something meaningful within the constraints of who I actually am. I threw myself back into work, but differently this time. Instead of using work to escape from personal pain, I used personal pain to fuel work that mattered. Every rocket that failed taught me something about resilience. Every production problem at Tesla became an opportunity to practice patience and persistence. Every criticism from the media became practice in maintaining focus on long-term goals despite short-term setbacks. Slowly, very slowly, I started to rebuild my sense of self-worth based on contribution rather than just achievement, on growth rather than just success, on the impact I could have on problems bigger than my own happiness. Tesla survived its near-death experience and went on to prove that electric cars could be mainstream. SpaceX recovered from its failures and achieved things that had seemed impossible. But more importantly, I survived my near-death experience and learned that I could be okay. Not just functional, but genuinely okay, even when my personal life didn't match my professional accomplishments. The divorce that almost broke me became the experience that taught me how to be unbreakable. Not in the sense of being invulnerable to pain, but in the sense of being able to find meaning and purpose even when life doesn't give you everything you thought you needed to be happy. I learned that love isn't the only source of meaning in life, and that the inability to sustain romantic relationships doesn't disqualify you from having a meaningful impact on the world. I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is accept your limitations and build a beautiful life within them, rather than constantly trying to overcome limitations that might be fundamental to who you are. Today, I'm grateful for that divorce, as painful as it was. Not because I'm glad the marriage ended, but because going through that darkness taught me things about resilience, self-acceptance, and purpose that I couldn't have learned any other way. It taught me that you can survive losing something you thought you couldn't live without. It taught me that identity can be rebuilt, that self-worth can be redefined, that happiness can be found in unexpected places. Most importantly, it taught me that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is also the thing that forces you to discover strength you didn't know you had, wisdom you hadn't developed, and possibilities you hadn't considered. If you're going through a divorce right now, or any kind of loss that feels like it might destroy you, I want you to know that survival is possible. Not just survival, but eventual thriving. The person you become after going through something that almost breaks you can be stronger, wiser, and more capable of genuine happiness than the person you were before. The pain you're feeling right now is real and valid and deserves to be honored, but it's not permanent, and it's not the end of your story. Sometimes we have to lose the life we planned in order to find the life we're meant to live. Share this with someone who might need to hear that they can survive what feels unsurvivable.